4 years ago, I released my English joiner's bench. It's a super cheap, super easy workbench. In fact, it's so easy, there's only one joint in the whole thing. It's this half lap joint right here. There's nothing to it. And when I did the video, I even said that any monkey with a handsaw could cut this joint. And yeah, since I said that, I've gotten a lot of messages from people saying, well, I guess I'm dumber than a monkey because I had trouble with the joint. And that's a fair criticism. It's not my job to tell you that things are easy. It's my job to make them easy. So I'm gonna cut some lengths of 2x4, plane them up, get a flat face, straighten up the edge, and mark the face and the edge. Even for a half lap, we need accurate joinery, so we need a face and a face edge that are even and perpendicular. Now, before we make our half lap joint, we're gonna do kind of a control, just do a face grain to face grain glue joint. There's a lot of surface area here, and because we're going face to face, there's some good reasons why this might be a nice, strong connection. So what I've done is laid out a line across my lower piece, which is gonna help keep things square. I'm gonna put my upper piece right on top of it, and this is a good time to look at those surfaces. Here's where I planed, really smooth. Here's the natural texture of this 2x4 with the mill finish. This is way too rough to be a good glue surface. This is one of the reasons that if you're making a big slab top bench, you've really gotta prep those surfaces somehow if you wanna get a good glue joint. So let me align these two pieces using that line that I just made, and then when I'm happy with that, I'll strike a line across the top. That's gonna tell me where my glue goes. It's a lot easier to keep the glue in the right spot if you have some lines. I've got the other end of my piece on a scrap piece of 2x, and that's gonna let me line them up easily. And now I'd like to clamp them. Fingers hold the piece to the bench, thumb holds the two pieces together, and I'll bring them right over the edge. When it's on there lightly, then we have an opportunity to micro adjust the joint. Feel for a flush end with my finger, cinch that nice and tight. Now, there's plenty of surface area here, which is good, but it's not really a true joint. The pieces aren't locked together in any way, and it's also a cross grain joint. So as these two pieces expand and contract in different directions, the glue joint could just pop off. But this is well-seasoned softwood, which doesn't move very much. Sometimes you can get away with something like this. We're gonna let this joint dry overnight, and tomorrow we'll see how strong it is. Now, I don't really trust that face-to-face joint, so let's do a real half lap. It's very simple. It just means we're gonna remove half the material here at the end of the joint. And that's gonna do a couple of things for us. For one thing, it's gonna preserve that face-to-face glue joint. We're gonna have the exact same glue area. But when we cut away half this material, we're gonna pick up a shoulder. That's gonna give us another glue surface. And when the shoulder matches up to this edge here, that should really help these pieces fight twisting side to side. A half lap should be a huge improvement over a basic face-to-face glue joint, and cutting it is really straightforward. So here's my top piece, the one that I'm gonna take half out of. In fact, this used to just be called a halving joint. Calling it a half lap joint is a new thing. I'll need a marking gauge to make sure I get my lines laid out correctly. This Stanley gauge has a ruler on the side, which is pretty handy. I know my stock started out as 1.5 inches, so I'm gonna set my gauge to 3/4. But I'm not gonna trust it because I planed this stock. So I'm gonna take my gauge, I'm gonna go in from one side, make a tiny little tick mark, come around to the other side, and those lines don't quite match up. I can micro adjust my gauge super simply just by tapping it on the bench, and then I'll do the same thing. Check, rotate, check. Now those two tick marks line up perfectly. This is my prepared face. You can see the F that I made right there, and I'm gonna do all my gauging from the face. I can't trust this other side at all. I like to use my compass rose planing stop for this. It gives me something to push against, and then I can put the other end against, well, Paul Sellers calls this relaxed muscle, and God bless him for it. What a nice thing to say. Put my gauge against that surface, see where my pencil tick mark is, Doing several light passes with the gauge is always better than doing a heavy pass. It's easier, and the gauge is much less likely to follow the grain and get taken off track. Now I have to go across that end grain. I'm going to put it right in the corner of the vise in the bench right here, brace it against my thigh, still registering the gauge, and I'm going to go right across that top. The end grain's a little tricky, but again, many light passes. I want to stay against this face, so I'm going to rotate, go back to my planing stop, pick up my line, and gauge down the opposite side. We'll run a pencil in those gauge lines because those lines can be tough to see. So there's most of our layout. Now the next thing I need to do is make sure I know where my shoulder is going to go. If I put this top board against the bottom, just like this, I'm going to flush up that end and come in underneath and make a little tick mark with that knife. And while I can see it, I'll just deepen that tick mark just a tiny bit. And then to make that shoulder, I'm going to make sure that I'm registering against my edge. Be careful with the knife, that wasn't good practice. Here's my edge right here that I want to register my square against. My tick mark is over here. I'll put my knife in my tick mark and slide up right to my knife. And then I can strike that line. And then the last thing to do is connect that shoulder line to my layout lines. Slide my square up. Great. Now, what I've got here is a layout that's an awful lot like a tenon, and all I'm actually doing here is cutting basically half a tenon. This is great practice for cutting more complicated joints as you get more advanced in your woodwork. One thing that you might forget to do is know which side is your waist, so a couple of X's in the waist can be really helpful. And then I'm going to put the piece in the vise angled just like this and tighten her up. The angle for a piece like this is really useful because it lets me see two of my layout lines at the same time. I can see the side and also the end. And that's really valuable because I want to track both of those with the saw at the same time. That's going to give me a really clean cut. So starting right on that corner and using my thumb to guide my saw, I'm just in the waist side of that line. Draw back again, and start sawing. The angle really does make this easy. I can see both of my lines, and I can see that I'm progressing on track. It doesn't matter that I get fully half the joint sawn here. The thing that really matters is that I get about halfway across the top, and I'll show you why in just a minute. I'm about halfway down here and halfway across the top, and that's great. Now what I'm going to do is reverse my work in the vise, and I'm going to have to move my rack stop for that. And we're going to come across just like this. Now I've got the exact same thing, but on the opposite corner. Start the saw again with a pull stroke. And track both those lines at once. And I'm watching carefully to make sure that both of my lines join up across the top here. I've got the saw a bit more shallow, and I'm working down my long end. The more of a kerf I have down on this edge, the easier it's going to be to complete the joint. We'll get pretty low in the vise because we don't want too much leverage on the piece while we're sawing it. Now, what I have going on here is I've sawn down here, and I've sawn down here, and I have a triangle of waist that I haven't removed in the middle of the joint. Now I've set the piece plumb in the vise, and I'm going to saw straight down. I've worked all the way across this end grain line here, so it's very easy to drop into that and continue sawing. Now, the cheeks of my joint, if this were mortise and tenon, are sawn, and I just have to do that shoulder. For that, I'm going to reset at the other end of the bench in bench hooks. Bench hooks are my favorite way to cut cross grain because they hold the work really securely, but it's still free, and I can flip it and manipulate it any way I want to. I'm just going to make this one cut right here for the shoulder, but before I do that, I would love to have a knife wall right here and not just rely on that knife line. I've got a tool well in my bench, and that gives me something to brace the end against, and I'll pull my bench hook out a little bit, and then I have a nice wide chisel. I'm going to set it just a 1/16 of an inch outside of my knife line and then wiggle it in. There's a little thunk you might be able to hear when the chisel actually hits that wall. Flick out the chips, and that's going to hold my back saw really securely. I also do my cross-cutting generally with rip saws, and they don't always cross-cut perfectly cleanly, but if you make a knife wall, then you have a clean edge and you don't have to worry about it. So this is, again, a lot like doing a tenon. The thing to do is start on the far end, feel the saw in your knife wall, give it a little pull back. It's nicely lined up with the fence of my bench hook. That gives me a nice visual reference, and I'm going to saw a bit. Just till I'm halfway across. Then I'll start on the other side, feel the knife wall, draw the saw back, and nibble away until I connect. Now I've got a really nice line with a very crisp edge over here because I made that edge with the knife wall. Now I can saw down to my baseline. Now I'm all the way down, closest to me. I can see that I've met that line perfectly. Now I'm going to watch that far side. And my piece comes away nice and cleanly. I've got a good surface on the inside. This joint's not going to take much trimming at all. Now, it would be wonderful if this joint was ready to go off the saw, but I live in the real world where joints usually need a little bit of a trim. I always do my trimming in the vise, and I do it straight up and down like this. There's more than one way to do it, but I find this way I can look straight down the joint, and it's really obvious what's going on. I came off my line a tiny bit while I was sawing, but I came off into the waist, which means I still have a perfectly good joint with just a tiny bit of extra material down here at the bottom. It's not going to be a big deal, especially with my easy vantage point from the top. Again, I'm going to use a wide chisel because that's going to give me the most accuracy, and it's also going to be quick. And I just need to work straight down because I can just see again from the top that the joint has just a bit of belly right there, which I do not want in the finished joint. That's going to give me a very poor surface. Ideally, the joint is going to be perfectly flat, but it could also be a tiny bit hollow here in the middle. That would also give an acceptable joint. There's a tiny bit of material the saw missed here in the corner, but it's quite easy to take that out with the corner of the chisel. And important to note, I have the chisel lifted up a tiny bit, so I can't mess up this edge here. That's going to be important in the finished joint. This is a nice, clean, well-trimmed joint, and it's ready for glue up. Just kidding. This joint actually still has a little bit of a belly in it, but it's such a large joint, I can clean it up with my jack plane. I'm going to make sure I register the toe of the plane right on here, and I'm not going to let the blade go past this edge because it'll blow it out. But for cleaning up in the middle and creating a flat surface, a hand plane really can't be beat, and if I'd like to be even more accurate, I can flip the piece around this way. Same thing, stay in the middle, don't blow out the far edge. And now we have a much cleaner joint ready for assembly. This joint is much easier to put together because I have this shoulder, so alignment isn't going to be a problem. And I'm going to show you a different technique for assembly here. I've backed my vice jaw out, and that gives me a nice stable platform with clearance for clamping. I've already drawn my lines, so let me apply the glue. Fit the top piece using my lines to make sure it's in exactly the right place and give it some downward pressure. Now, I would call this a workbench joint still. I have a nice clean line here on the top, but because of the rounded edge of the 2x4, the corner is a tiny bit gappy. I would never allow that on a piece of furniture, but like I said, this is more of a workbench joint, and I think it's acceptable for that. I'm going to try some of those one-handed clamps one of these days. Those look handy. And here's a second piece, a more traditional half lap with a shoulder, and we'll let this dry. But there's another variation we can do, and we'll cut that right now. Now that we've made the most basic version of this joint, let's evolve it a little bit. The next step is to take the same half lap joint we've made before and sink the top piece into the bottom piece so that they're flush. This is similar to a mortise and tenon joint, and it's much more appropriate for like actual furniture. Now, because I've left workbench joinery behind and I'm stepping up my joinery, I can't really have that rounded edge from the 2x4 anymore. That's not going to let me make precise work. So I took a few minutes and planed the narrow edges of all my stock until I got rid of that rounded edge and then touched it up with a finely set jack plane. So this is nice, square, true lumber, and I'm going to get clean joints suitable for furniture work. The exact location doesn't matter because I'm not making an actual piece of furniture. With firm pressure, I'm going to take my marking knife and trace one side of the joint here. And I'm keeping the knife fairly up and down, so I trace that edge accurately. To trace the other side, I'm actually going to angle my knife inward a little bit. So instead of holding it like this, I'm going to hold it like this and strike my line several times lightly. And what I'm doing here is deliberately undercutting a little bit. I'm trying to make this joint a little bit too tight, and you'll see why in just a minute. Now, since I want this piece to sink all the way into this one, I've set my marking gauge to the exact depth of this piece, and registering off my trued up face, I'm going to strike that depth line just like this, rotate the piece so I'm still registering against my reference face, strike the other side. Then I'll use my square and my knife to connect these layout lines to my depth lines. Once I've gone over my layout lines with a pencil, it's obvious what stock I want to remove. Knife wall, saw down my shoulders, relief cuts to weaken the waist, bevel up chisel to remove the bulk of the waist, two-handed chisel grip to get close to my layout lines. Router plane takes us down to finished depth. The router is especially good at getting me down to my gauge lines on the edges of the joint, and it's really precise there. And then that leaves a little bit of high material in the middle, and that's quicker just to chisel out. Now, just as I was hoping, the top piece is too tight. It won't go in. And that's perfect because it lets me micro adjust for the tightest fit. The obvious move is to trim this side of the joint right here, but I have a nice crisp line. If I go chiseling on this, I'm just going to mess it up. The much better move is to take my top piece, my tenon, put it in the vise, and just take a shaving or two right there. And I know that my piece is especially tight on the top, so I'm mostly planing there. Better to go slow than to take too much. Let's have a look now. I'll see much better. I can start to wiggle that joint in. That's almost there. I'm going to reset my plane for an even finer shaving because that was a little coarse. And let's take another shaving. There. Nice. We're almost in. This is just going to take a tiny bit more trimming for a perfect fit. This joint came together so tightly it didn't even need a clamp, but I put one on anyway because I'm insecure. Now that last joint was good enough that it even works for some furniture projects, but there's one more variation we can do on the half lap that's even stronger and it looks a little bit cooler too. Here's a half lap just like we've been using for this whole video, but this time, instead of leaving both the sides straight, we're going to cut in at an angle and take out a little piece of material over here. This joint isn't super well known because it comes out of the timber framing tradition, and it's actually a kind of dovetail. When we take this angled piece and set it into our top board like this, that angle is going to create a powerful wedging action that's really going to resist any downward force like this. It's a really strong joint. It looks cool, and the best part is it's not really any more difficult to cut than what we've already done. The layout for this end isn't difficult. I've just taken my square and a pencil and carried my shoulder around to the front, and I've come in 3/4 of an inch over here and then made a little tick 1/8 of an inch in from there. I'm going to take the rule out of my combination square, connect that 3/4 to that 1/8 and strike a line. What angle is this? I have no idea. I'm really just eyeballing it. You can see how the angle is fairly shallow and it just has a good proportionate look to it. This is going to be just fine. Now I've got the piece in the vise. I have my cut line towards me so it's easy to see, and I've angled the piece so the line I'm cutting is plumb. I also carried my line across the top so it's easy to get started, and that's also why I moved the top of my line in 1/8 of an inch. If I was trying to start on the corner here, that's impossible. Moving in just a little bit is much easier. So I'll start at the far end, get the cut started nice and perpendicular, and as I cut, you're going to see me drop the saw so I can really track this line. To do this shoulder, I've given myself a knife wall across the top. That's going to guide my saw and help me stay on track. Light trim on that sawn edge. Trace it. And take out the waste. Glue and assemble. And it's going together pretty well, but I'm probably going to put a clamp on it. Let's be honest. Now that we've made 4 versions of this joint, we should do a little testing. I don't have a super scientific testing apparatus, but neither did traditional furniture makers 100 or 200 years ago. If they were trying out a new joint, they'd put it together and tug on it a little bit and see what happens. So I think we should just do that. Your body, your senses, can actually tell you a lot about a piece of furniture or a new joint. So this is my face grain to face grain connection. It's pretty good because there's a lot of surface area in the joint, and I expect it to be pretty strong because modern wood glue is really good. Now, the problems with this joint are if you have any wood movement, if this piece expands and contracts a little bit, and this piece is expanding and contracting in the opposite direction, that joint's going to pop right apart because there's no mechanical interlock. So it's not really a joint in that way. No matter how strong it is today, this joint, I really wouldn't trust it to stand the test of time. But let's take a look at it anyway. One type of force is this way, back and forth, and I get a lot of movement here, but that's also because this top piece is twisting a lot. So I don't think that has anything to do with the joint. And with this one, I wouldn't expect any movement in the joint until we get sudden failure, because again, there's no joinery, there's just the glue. It feels quite strong this way. I would expect the joint to be a little bit less strong going up and down because there's no mechanical joint of any kind. Let's pull up and down. Oh, if anything, it's better that way. You know, I'm just about lifting up the bench here, and the joint is pretty good. So the other thing we could test is a sudden shock to the joint. Okay, it moved a little, but it seems fine. Let's give it another one. Yeah, that's what I was afraid of. This joint did fail suddenly and completely. And some of the wood tore out. It's more a failure of the wood than the glue because the glue is really strong, but I really wouldn't use a joint like this for anything. Even a workbench would probably be a bad idea. Introducing just a little bit of joinery like a shoulder should make a difference in how this joint works. Here's our first variation on the joint. This is the most basic half lap you could possibly make. Only the top piece of timber is lapped. I've done nothing to the bottom piece. And so all I've gained here is a little bit of a shoulder right here in the corner. And that wouldn't make any difference to the joint when we go this way, back and forth, because there's no mechanical interlock there, but I do expect some difference up and down this way. And the joint feels really different. My feeling on this is that it's a little bit better. Now, if I were actually going to use this for a piece, I would always reinforce a joint like this because there isn't a lot of joinery going on. For a workbench, and that's where I think this joint really shines, a pair of screws right here, that would be perfect. With a shoulder and a pair of screws pinning the joint together, even if you have expansion, contraction, and glue failure, it's still not going to come apart. I think that's what makes this a really great joint for somebody making a basic beginner workbench. It's not very difficult to cut, and it gives you some mechanical interlock. Let's try giving it a whack. I think this one will probably fail when I hit it, but that shoulder should make a difference. Let's see. Not bad. I'm gonna hit it a little harder. Okay, I'm gonna hit it as hard as I can, harder than I hit the other one. Yep, but I can tell just with my senses that definitely took more force. So this piece came apart, and again, it was the wood that failed, not the glue. But this shoulder gave it a lot more resistance to this up and down motion. Also, if there was force pushing on it like this, that shoulder would make a great connection with this upright. So this joint is definitely an improvement over just a face-to-face connection. Now we're getting into what I would call real joinery. This is a traditional half lap or halved joint where I've taken away half the wood on both pieces and joined them together tightly. There's a shoulder here in the back, and then the joint is also captured here and here with two more shoulders. So this is something that I would call a real joint. I would even use this in a piece of furniture, and I have, and it's always worked out well. Also, because modern yellow glue is really strong. There isn't a ton of interlock here, like you'd have with a dovetail, for instance, but it's still a pretty good joint. You could reinforce it further by maybe putting a dowel right in the middle here. Depends on whether you like that look or not, but that would only make the joint stronger. The place that it's somewhat weak is this way. There's nothing to keep this piece from lifting out, especially if it's under a lot of twisting force. But I'm twisting this thing pretty hard and nothing's happening. Here, I can move the bench back and forth, and I've got pieces of railroad track on the other end of the bench to make it as heavy as possible. So I'm shifting a lot of weight here and the joint's not moving. Now the place I expect it to really be strong is this way, because there's three perpendicular surfaces resisting any up or down force. So I think I should be able to smack the bejesus out of this thing. As weird as it sounds, I can feel the difference even in the dead blow. There's just a rigid sense here. Let's pick this back up again. This vise was not meant for this level of abuse. Okay, and just like I've done with the other ones, I am going to unscientifically hit it as hard as I can. That's a pretty heavy hit, and you can see what I've done to the end of the wood. It's really dented up and splintered from the dead blow, but it didn't do anything to the joint. Just by sinking this piece in and making them into a single piece, making a real joint has made a huge difference. You saw me cut this joint. It wasn't super difficult. You don't have to be incredibly accurate. And with modern yellow glue, it's really strong. I literally can't beat this thing apart with a mallet. Not bad, but we've got one more variation to look at. Here's our final variation on the half lap joint. This is a half lap dovetail joint with a single angle right here. Of course, you can do it with 2 angles and make it look a little nicer. I've done that before. And in the timber framing trade, this was actually just called a dovetail joint. You don't see this joint so much in furniture, but there's nothing wrong with it. If it's neatly executed, it actually looks really great. And I think it's going to be the strongest out of all of these joints, because that angle is going to create a wedging action that's only going to tighten the joint as force is applied. Now, I'm going to mostly put force down on the joint when I wail on it with the mallet, and for that construction, I should have flipped it. If this angle here is on the top, it's going to be better at resisting downward force because that wedging action is going to be even better. This is a big reason why I always talk about practicing and doing your joinery ahead of a project. If I were practicing this before I used it in a piece of furniture, I'd be able to say, oh, you know what? If I'm going to put it here at the end of a piece, I really should flip it. It saves a lot of heartache if you look at something before you put it in a project. It's really just like the other joints in this direction. It's nice and solid, and all this motion that I'm getting, all of this twist, this is just because this vertical piece is flexing back and forth. This is spruce. It has a lot of flex. Pushing it up and down, yeah, it feels solid. So really the only thing to do is hit it. I mean, that was already pretty hard. Okay, as hard as I can hit it. That's everything. Oh, I think, no, I thought. So I might have actually managed to break the glue joint back here at the shoulder. But what's interesting is the rest of the joint is still perfectly tight. So this is more redundant than I thought it was. Even if this had a serious shock and one of the glue surfaces failed, it's probably the least important glue surface because there's still just that mechanical joint here. This end grain is butting up against this long grain and helping to prevent flexing. If the glue breaks, it's obviously not a catastrophe because the rest of the joint is still good. This half-lap dovetail is a surprisingly good joint. It even works for furniture, and it's not that hard to make. I hope this video opened up the possibilities for half-laps. As your half-lap joinery gets more advanced, you can use it for furniture and nice projects, but even the most basic half-lap joint is good for your first workbench. They're strong enough for that and easy to execute. Maybe not easy enough for a monkey to do, but easy enough for you to do. And if you still haven't built your first woodworking bench, consider our original English joiner's bench. It's been 4 years and it's still our most popular design. Go on Instagram and search for the tag The Joiner's Bench, and you will see literally hundreds of examples of this bench built by people all over the world. And a lot of folks like me have been using this bench for years with no complaints. I just looked and our 40-page complete joiner's bench bundle is still $10. We haven't adjusted for inflation at all, and we really should. So that price is probably going to come up in the next couple of weeks, but right now it's still $10. Go ahead and grab that while it's still inexpensive. CompassRoseTools.com, that's my company. We make router planes, bench planing stops, and a bunch of other things just for hand tool woodworkers. Patreon.com/Rex Krueger. All of my patrons get all of my plans for free, including that 40-page Joiner's Bench bundle. They get early access to all the Compass Rose tools. They get discounts on all the Compass Rose tools, an amazing discussion forum, and it's only $5 a month. Thanks to everybody who helps make these videos possible by buying plans, becoming a patron, or just watching the videos. We love our viewers, and we're super glad that you're here. See you next week.